was the night of May 13th, 2008. A man was driving along Highway 68 in rural Minnesota after visiting friends. At some point, his car became stuck. While on the phone with his parents, something suddenly went wrong. The last thing they heard him say was, "Oh shit." The man was never found again, and this is his terrifying story. Brandon Victor Swanson was born on January 30th, 1989 in Spencer, Iowa. To his parents, Brian and Annette Swanson, he was the first of two children and grew up with a younger sister. When Brandon was still young, the family moved to Marshall, Minnesota, a small community in Lyon County, where he would spend most of his life. Marshall was a quiet rural town, surrounded by flat farmland and long stretches of open countryside. It was a place where people were familiar with their surroundings and where driving between towns was a normal part of daily life. Brandon attended Marshall Senior High School and graduated in the spring of 2007. Later that year, he enrolled in the wind energy program at Minnesota West Community and Technical College, located in Canby, a small town roughly 170 miles west of St. Paul. To attend classes and visit friends, Brandon regularly traveled the highways and back roads of southwestern Minnesota, routes he had grown accustomed to over time. Brandon stood about 5 feet 6 inches tall and weighed around 120 pounds. He had been blind in his left eye since birth due to a congenital condition, and while he wore glasses to improve vision in his right eye, his depth perception was limited, particularly in low-light conditions. Despite this, he was independent and capable, and those close to him said he never allowed the condition to interfere with his everyday life. On May 13th, 2008, the final day of classes at Minnesota West Community and Technical College, 19-year-old Brandon Swanson was in a celebratory mood. He had just finished his first year of college, and like many students, he planned to spend the night relaxing with friends. That evening, Brandon joined a small group at a rented house in Lind, Minnesota. Friends later said he seemed calm, sociable, and clear-headed. There was nothing about the night that felt unusual. No arguments, no tension, nothing that hinted at what was coming. Sometime between 10:30 and 11 p.m., Brandon left alone, intending to visit another friend in Canby, about 35 miles away. Later, before starting the drive home to Marshall, he called a different friend to let them know he was heading back. The most direct route home was State Highway 68, a familiar 2-lane road cutting through long stretches of farmland and open countryside. Brandon had driven it many times before. But somewhere along that drive, something went wrong. At some point, Brandon left the highway and ended up on a maze of rural gravel roads. Whether he took a wrong turn or misjudged his location isn't clear. At night, these roads were especially dangerous, poorly marked, unlit, and nearly identical in every direction. Investigators believe Brandon may have intentionally avoided the main highway, possibly to avoid law enforcement and the risk of a DUI stop. Some unverified reports suggest he had previously been arrested for DUI and had recently completed probation. A second offense could have had serious consequences. The back roads in this area didn't run parallel to the highway. Instead, they intersected at sharp angles, forcing drivers to make multiple turns just to stay on course. One wrong move could leave you completely disoriented. While driving along a minimum maintenance road, essentially a field access path between two large crop fields, Brandon attempted to turn onto a gravel road missed the approach and slid into a shallow ditch. The impact was minor, but the car became stuck, hung up on the frame, and unable to move. Believing he was near the town of Lind, Brandon called his parents for help. Brian and Annette Swanson immediately got into their pickup truck and began driving toward the area while staying on the phone with their son. Brandon remained near his car, flashing his headlights so they could find him. But neither side could see the other. For 47 minutes, Brandon described his surroundings: fences, open fields, distant lights he believed were coming from Lind. But as his parents followed his directions, nothing matched. They knew the area well, yet none of the landmarks he described seemed to exist where he thought he was. At one point, Brandon claimed he was just off Highway 23, a detail that would later raise serious questions. His car was ultimately found near Highway 68, suggesting he may have been confused about both his location and orientation. As frustration grew, Brandon made a decision. At 2:17 a.m., he told his parents he was leaving the car and walking toward the lights he could see in the distance. He believed town was close. He told his father to meet him at the Linwood Tavern in Lind. As he walked, Brandon stayed on the phone, updating his parents. He mentioned crossing fences. He said he could hear running water. At one point, he left the road entirely, choosing to cut across open land, believing it would be faster. Then, just after 3 a.m., the call changed. Brandon suddenly said 2 words: "Oh shit." The line went silent. Repeated calls to Brandon's phone rang out into the night, unanswered. Each time his parents tried again, the same result: ringing, then silence, no voicemail, no movement, no voice on the other end. What stood out immediately was this: the phone was still on. Into the next morning, Brandon's phone continued to ring before eventually going to voicemail. This suggested it hadn't been destroyed, submerged, or intentionally powered off, at least not right away. Wherever Brandon had gone, his phone remained active long after his last words were spoken. At 6:30 a.m., Brian and Annette Swanson reported their son missing to the Lyon County Sheriff's Office. But the response was slow. Brandon was 19 years old, legally an adult. To law enforcement, it wasn't unusual for a college student to stay out late, especially after finals week. There was no immediate evidence of a crime, and no clear sign that Brandon was in danger. Still, something felt deeply wrong. Later that day, investigators obtained Brandon's cell phone records, and with that, the case took a sudden and unsettling turn. Brandon had not been anywhere near Lind. Cell tower data showed his phone had pinged a tower near Tatton, a small rural community located miles south of where Brandon believed himself to be. This revelation immediately raised troubling questions. How could Brandon be so confident about his location, yet be so completely wrong? Search efforts shifted at once. Around 12:30 p.m., deputies located Brandon's vehicle, a Chevrolet Lumina, abandoned in a shallow ditch on a remote gravel road near the Lyon-Lincoln County line. The car wasn't wrecked. It wasn't damaged. It was simply stuck, hung up on the frame, unable to move forward or backward. Inside the vehicle, there were no keys, no wallet, no phone, no personal belongings scattered nearby. Even more unsettling, investigators found no clear footprints leading away from the car. No disturbed grass, no obvious trail. It was as if Brandon had stepped out of the vehicle and vanished into the land itself. To anyone passing by, the scene would have looked ordinary. Just another car stuck on a country road. Nothing about it screamed emergency, except Brandon Swanson was gone. What followed was one of the most exhaustive and frustrating road searches in Minnesota's recent history. The terrain quickly revealed itself as a nightmare for search and rescue teams. Southwestern Minnesota is defined by vast open farmland, flat fields stretching endlessly beneath an enormous sky. During the day, the openness is deceptive. At night, it becomes disorienting and unforgiving. There are few landmarks, few lights, few points of reference. Farmhouses are spread miles apart. Roads blur into one another. Gravel paths cut through fields with no signs or markings. In total darkness, it is frighteningly easy to walk in circles without realizing it. Search dogs were brought in and immediately picked up Brandon's scent near the abandoned vehicle. The trail led south, then west, then north, a wandering, inconsistent path that reflected confusion rather than intention. Eventually, the scent led toward the Yellow Medicine River. One bloodhound entered the river briefly before emerging and continuing the trail on the opposite bank. This moment became one of the most debated details in the case. Did Brandon fall in? Did he cross successfully? Or did the water distort the scent? Despite the uncertainty, search efforts intensified. Law enforcement, volunteers, and specialized units combed the area relentlessly. Fields were walked. Rivers were searched. Ditches were examined. Helicopters scanned from above. Boats moved slowly through the water. The search eventually covered more than 120 square miles. And still, nothing. Eventually, somewhere beyond the reach of search teams, behind tall grass within marshland, or on private land that was never fully searched, he may have collapsed. Dense vegetation, seasonal flooding, wildlife activity, and limited access could have concealed his remains permanently. Sometimes the land doesn't give answers back.